Hello, students, and welcome to week 2 of Horror and Science Fiction. This week we're going to cover the origins of horror, and it's also going to be a double feature. We're going to cover 2 separate monsters this week because we can. So we'll start with folklore, oral and written history is one of the origins of horror. So before we even started writing things down and writing novels and things like that, there were people that had oral traditions, and well, these people were scared, so they talked about monsters and things like that, and some early written history. So tribal polytheism and myths, there were a lot of very monstrous gods and demigods and titans and demons and things like that that people worshipped or feared. This was relatively common. If you didn't understand why it was dark at night, well, a monster was probably responsible. Or if your friend or child died early, then there was probably a demon or a witch or something responsible for that. So that's the way people responded before they really had the knowledge of how that happened. We also have the Old and New Testament all chock full of monsters and demons and things like that. Beowulf, which started as an oral story and then was finally written down. That's one of our first true monster stories. The Middle Ages was a time where people had very little knowledge, and a lot of monsters we have today, vampires, werewolves, things like that, really got their start during the Dark Ages because people weren't that educated. A lot of terrible things happened. Huge parts of the population died due to plague. There were all kinds of horrific and monstrous possible solutions for that. Next we have Gothic literature. So once we actually move to people actually writing things and intentionally devising horror stories, we get things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818, which is considered to be the first horror novel. Could also be one of the first sci-fi novels too. Then you have Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Edgar Allan Poe is one of the first genreists. He dealt almost entirely in the macabre and horrific subjects. Moving into the 20th century, we have German Expressionism and some very early cinema. We have The Golem from 1913, which is basically about a Jewish Frankenstein. Nosferatu, which is kind of an off-brand Count Dracula from 1922, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, which is kind of an early hypnotist and zombie story. And this all came out of German Expressionism, which also had a normal artistic bent to it as well, painting and other forms of art, but there was definitely a cinema version of that coming out of Europe and Germany in particular. Then we have Hollywood horror, the Universal horror pictures of the 1930s, which is a lot of the images of this is kind of emblazoned on our collective consciousness. So Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and The Mummy all came out kind of 1, 2, 3 in the early 1930s and kind of solidified Universal Pictures images of these particular monsters. So the first monster we're going to talk about today is the werewolf. So here's a picture of the Man of 1,000 Faces, Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman. It kind of looks like a pig as much as a wolf, but that's just me. So what is a werewolf? How is it different from a normal wolf? Well, it's a monster wolf for one thing, so it also has a human component as well. So you have someone who is a shapeshifter, whether it's a warlock or a witch, because there's definitely occult overtones here, or someone who ends up getting bitten by a werewolf and then they become doomed to transform when the moon is full. So we know what it is, what the werewolf is. What does it represent? One of the things is a complete loss of self-control, because there's this huge difference between the person in human form and then when they become the wolf, there really isn't any of their normal human inhibitions. So you have the primal beast lurking deep within. That's another thing the werewolf gets at, as if all of us have this thing that could come out of us. We just need something to kind of trigger it. And also the perils of power and immortality, because a werewolf is an enormously destructive and powerful creature, but it can't be controlled. And so they almost always have to be killed at some point in the film cycle. But of course, they're otherwise immortal, and you have to have the silver bullet to kill it or something else. So that's an important part of it too. Power and immortality, but there's a huge price you have to pay because it's something that's not controllable. So what is the appeal of the werewolf? Why is this a monster that we return to again and again? One is it's truly bestial, so it's definitely scary, and there are a lot of opportunities for terrible things to happen, but there's also something kind of tragically human inside there. And you have this person that was otherwise normal before, and due to some tragic accident, now they are a werewolf, and it's beyond their control. So that's an important part of it. It makes for a very emotional narrative. There's plenty of opportunities for savagery, gore, and awesome transformations. So that's a important part of that. The werewolf is going to go on a rampage, and it's going to be really bloody, and that's something we like, that element of the abject. The werewolf definitely gets to that. And then also the transformation scenes. These are some things we definitely look forward to. It's like, at what point is the person going to become the wolf? What's it going to be like? Hopefully they won't make it too short and quick, which unfortunately they do in some of the underworld movies. The transformation looks very painful. That's another, blurring of boundaries that we have. Another example of the abject that we talked about last week. Happy endings we don't get quite as much of in werewolf films, unfortunately. They usually have to kind of end the same way. Not a lot of happy werewolf endings. So common themes and techniques we see in werewolf films. One is the monster as a victim. So in some cases you have the monster as the aggressor and definitely the antagonist. But sometimes you have the protagonist of the film unfortunately becomes the werewolf, and then they have to deal with this, which may make them more of an anti-hero. So the survivor is cursed not just with the memory of being attacked and maybe their friends died in the same time, but now he or she is doomed to repeat the cycle, so you end up with monster PTSD. Now, the movie you watch for this part of the class is definitely going to get to that quite a bit. Also, the idea of the visceral transformation. So the audience has to see every painful detail of the transformation process. So once again, it kind of amplifies that pain that the character goes through. And also, this is kind of a monster birth, where the person becomes the werewolf and the werewolf is birthed. So once again, another example of the abject. And then also subjective camera is an important part of this. It's an important part of most horror films, but definitely in werewolf films, because you don't want to, give up what the werewolf looks too quickly. You don't want to show off too much. You want to save that for the end of the film. And so you see through its eyes and you get monster vision. And so you'll see the reaction of the victim as opposed to actually seeing the werewolf many times. And then also the startle effect is used quite a bit in werewolf films too. There's going to be a point where you're not sure where the werewolf is, and then all of a sudden they reappear, and you get the startle effect, or as some people call it, the jump scare. So the film we're going to cover for this is An American Werewolf in London, which is from 1981, directed by John Landis, who also directed Animal House, which was a bawdy comedy. There's certainly elements of that in this film too. So our synopsis: two young Americans are attacked by a werewolf while hiking in the north of England. One of them survives, but come the full next moon, he receives a nasty surprise, which is that, well, those scratches that he received are going to keep giving. So this was made in 1981, so I don't know how well you folks follow technology, but we had no digital technology in 1980, definitely for making monster movies in particular. So there are no digital werewolves in this. They're all done prosthetically in this film, which definitely lends more of a painful, visceral quality to the transformations of this. And this is really common to early 80s werewolf films. The Howling's another film from the same era that had some just fantastic transformations as well. And the makeup was done by Rick Baker, who was the transformative effects artist of the 80s and 90s. So if you were going to do some sort of monster or transformation scene, Rick Baker was the guy you talk to. So enjoy the film. And we're going to go on to part 2 here. So our second monster for today, the vampire. So first of all, what is a vampire? Well, as you can see, it can be depicted in a fair number of different ways. We've got our classic Dracula, our off-brand Dracula Nosferatu, who is not quite as suave. And then we also have our vampire bat, which is our real vampire. And then also we have the trickle down into children's programming with The Count. So it can be a lot of different things. The undead, the immortal, a blood drinker, an Eastern European guy in a cape. It could also be a sparkly hunk. Yes, we're talking about Edward here. Can be a lot of different things. But more importantly than what the vampire is, there is the question of what the vampire represents. And what is that? Starting with that idea that monsters are a magnification of pre-existing fears, we've got the fear of the dark and night, which is when the vampire comes out. Also the forbidden fruit of eternal life. So vampires have this air of immortality about them. They live until you kill them, basically. And that's something that's also forbidden. A loss of faith and or rejection of religion and morality. That's another integral part of the vampire. That idea, that kind of occult edge to it. Also xenophobia. There's a reason why vampires are often portrayed as being foreigners. Impossible love. Very often vampire stories are love stories as well. One person's a vampire, one person's a human. How's that ever going to work? Also the dangers of sex and STDs. The vampirism can be compared to that transmission or taking of blood. There's a sexual element to it as well. Also drug addiction, because the vampire's food is also a drug that it needs. And also eternal coolness. So vampires can be very monstrous, but they can also seem very cool as well, and something that people aspire to, especially young kids reading young adult novels ad nauseum. So why are vampires and vampire films popular? Well, there's a fair number of reasons, based on the subject matter they cover. One is we long for or fear immortality. So we want it, but we're also afraid of it. I mean, what would you do if you're alive forever? Also, there's that whole sex thing, exoticism, and the chance to become someone or something else. All things that we fear at the same time as we desire. So the vampire is right at that crux between fear and desire right there. And all of that are common romantic and young adult emotions. And we use the vampire as kind of a substitute for a lot of more adult themes that we could be getting into. Instead, it's like, well, they're vampires, that's why. So common vampire themes. One is vampires as gluttons. So as I said, their food is also their drug, and they can be very, very messy eaters. Sometimes you have your dainty vampires that will, very politely bite into someone's throat and quietly suck their blood. But most of the time it ends up getting very bloody very quickly. Also as hedonists, so that nightly prowl on the search of food also becomes kind of a party, or it could also be a seduction. So the vampire's food, that blood, is wrapped up in a whole bunch of different themes there. Also the idea of familiars. So familiars are humans who do vampires' bidding during the daytime in hopes of being turned. Although strangely, the familiars never quite get it. That fact that the vampires are never going to turn them, because as soon as the vampire turns the familiar, they have lost their most loyal servant. So it's never going to happen. But the familiars just keep doing it anyway. Poor bastards. Vampire weaknesses. So they're not always consistent. Some films will play these up more than others, but sunlight is a pretty common one and pretty universal. You also have garlic, silver, wooden stakes, starvation, pride, and also stupidity. All these things are the things that can, take a vampire down if you need to. And as I said, they're immortal until you kill them. And these weaknesses can often be the cause of their deaths. Also, vampires are often seen as plundering foreigners who invade to suck our valuable American blood, or in the case of the original Dracula story, he was sucking valuable British blood, an Eastern European who was coming to prey on the people of the British Empire. But most of the time you will see kind of a foreign aspect to the vampire, playing up these ideas of simultaneously of exoticism and xenophobia at the same time. Because we find these foreigners different and attractive, yet at the same time they also kind of scare us. So there are elements of that to it as well. So the film for this week the second film for this week is 30 Days of Night from 2007, directed by David Slade. So it's based on a 3-issue comic series of the same name, which became very popular, and so it expanded to 10 or more short series. I think it was up to 14 by latest reckoning. So our synopsis of it: as the northernmost city in North America prepares for a month of darkness, because as you know, the closer you are to the poles, the longer the nights and days can become, a shipload of vampires anchors off the coast, and for 30 days the vampires feast. So they're waiting for this moment where they can just basically have literally 30 days of night. I hate to use the movie title, but I have to right here. So this is a very grim and bloody re-examination of the vampire legend. Not a whole lot of seduction going on here. Definitely a whole lot more feasting. So in a way, it's almost more like a werewolf film in certain respects, because there's a whole lot of blood and gore here, and they really take every advantage or every opportunity they can to use that. So it's very different from the romantic visions of movies like Twilight, True Blood, and Vampire Diaries, where it kind of focuses on the seductive nature of the vampire. In this case, we're actually dealing with the gluttonous side of the vampire instead. So enjoy. Hopefully you folks enjoy your double feature this week.